He won the game. He had every right to walk away richer and never look back. Instead, Trent Carson looked at the woman who just lost years of her life to him across a poker table and offered her something unexpected. Not charity, not pity, a chance. And that single decision changed both their lives forever. This channel tells the stories the West was truly made of, not just gunfights and gold, but the love between a cowboy and the woman who matched him stride for stride, the tenderness of a mother's hands, the quiet dignity of people who had nothing but chose to give everything. The lesson: the most powerful thing one human being can offer another isn't money or mercy, it's the simple act of seeing their worth. If that hits something in your chest, you're in the right place. Subscribe, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments. When did someone see you clearly when nobody else did?
Across the table sat a man named Trent Carson, who owned nearly half the ranch land within 50 miles of San Antonio. He was 26, with skin weathered by the sun and dark hair that curled just a bit at his collar, no matter how hard he tried to slick it down. His eyes were the color of rich amber whiskey, and at that moment they were locked on her with a focus that made her insides twist in a way that had nothing to do with the game. "It is your bet, miss," he said, his voice deep and scratchy like boots on a dry road. Zelda looked at the mountain of cash sitting in the middle of the table. She had already pushed all her money in, which, to be fair, wasn't a whole lot. The other three men had folded their hands long ago, sensing the air crackle between her and Trent, knowing this had stopped being a friendly game and turned into something much more serious. "I do not have anything else to bet," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding like a drum. Trent leaned back, his chair groaning under his weight. He was a big fella with broad shoulders and the solid build of a man who works the land for a living. "Well, I reckon you are out then," he stated. But there was a hint in his tone that told her he wasn't ready for the game to be over. "Unless," Zelda said, thinking fast as the words left her mouth, "you might be willing to offer some credit." A low whisper rustled through the folks who had gathered to watch. Asking for credit in a poker game was a fool's errand, the sort of thing that created debts a person could never hope to pay back. Trent watched her for a long, silent moment. "And what kind of collateral are you putting up?" "My word," Zelda answered without hesitation. "If I lose this hand, I will work to pay off every cent I owe you. 1 month of my labor for every $100. Somebody behind her let out a low whistle. With the amount of money in that pot, she was talking about years of her life. But Zelda was sure of her hand, and even more sure that Trent was bluffing. She had been studying him all night, picking up on the little things that gave him away. The slight clenching of his jaw when he held a good hand, the single tap of his fingers on the table when he felt unsure. Right then, his hands were as still as a statue, but his shoulders were drawn up tight in a way she hadn't seen all night long. "That is a mighty generous offer," Trent said, his voice soft. "But I am not exactly looking for more ranch hands." "Then what is it you want?" The question slipped out, a bit bolder than she meant it to be, and she felt a blush creep up her neck. Trent's gaze grew more intense. For a second she thought he was about to say something that would make the whole saloon gasp, but instead he just glanced at his own cards and then looked back at her. "Tell you what, I will raise you Thunder." The whole room went dead silent. Thunder was Trent Carson's prized stallion, a powerful black horse that was famous all across Texas. Men had offered him small fortunes for that horse, and he had refused every single one. That animal was worth more than all the money on the table, worth more than what most men make in their entire lives. "You cannot be serious," Zelda whispered. "I am always serious about poker," Trent answered. "And I am serious about this bet. You match me with your promise of work. If you win, Thunder belongs to you. If I win, you work for me until your debt is cleared. Do we have ourselves a deal?" Zelda should have gotten up and walked out right then. Every bit of common sense she had was screaming at her to fold her hand and leave with what little pride she had left. But she looked down at her cards again, at the full house sitting there like a prayer answered, and she could almost hear her daddy's voice in her ear. "Never back down when you know you have got them beat, Zelda girl." "Deal," she said. She laid her cards down, one after the other. A 10 of hearts, a 10 of diamonds, a 10 of spades, a king of hearts, and a king of clubs. A full house, tens over kings. The crowd buzzed with excitement. It was a powerful hand, the kind that usually wins. Zelda let herself crack a small smile as she started to reach for the winnings. "Not so fast," Trent said, his voice low. He placed his own cards on the table, slow and deliberate. 4 queens and a 3 of diamonds. 4 of a kind. The smile vanished from Zelda's face. The room started to feel like it was tilting, and she had to grab the side of the table to keep herself upright. She had been so sure, so completely positive that she had him figured out. But she was wrong, terribly wrong. And now she owed this stranger a debt that seemed impossible to repay. "Well," she said, making her voice stay even as her whole world fell apart, "it looks like I will be seeing a lot more of you, Mr. Carson." Trent raked in his winnings without a change in his expression. "I suppose you will." He stood up and put on his hat. "Be at my ranch at sunrise tomorrow. It is 5 miles north of town. You cannot miss it. Just ask anyone for the Carson place." He started to walk away, but then he stopped and turned back to look at her. The noise of the saloon had returned, but in the space between the two of them, it was completely quiet. "You played a fine game tonight," he said, "the best I have had in years." And then he was gone, moving through the crowd and out into the dark night, leaving Zelda all alone with her shattered pride and the awful, sinking feeling that she had just gambled away her freedom to a man she didn't even know. She didn't get a wink of sleep that night. How could she? She just lay there in the little room she'd rented over the general store, staring up at the dark ceiling, trying to understand how her life had taken such a wrong turn. Her mother had passed away 2 years back, and without her father there to look out for her, Zelda learned real quick that the world wasn't kind to a woman on her own. She had drifted from one town to the next, using her card smarts to make just enough to get by, always managing to stay one step ahead of trouble. But it looked like trouble had finally run her down. When the first pale light of dawn started to peek through her window, Zelda got up and put on the only outfit she had that was fit for ranch work. It was a faded blue calico dress, frayed at the bottom and patched at the elbows. But it was tough. She braided her long reddish-brown hair and pinned it up tight, then splashed some cold water on her face from the bowl on her dresser. Her green eyes stared back at her from the mirror, looking tired but still full of fight. "You have been through worse than this," she whispered to her reflection, though she wasn't completely sure if that was true. It took her more than an hour to walk to the Carson ranch. The sun was just climbing over the horizon when she finally saw the place spread out in front of her, and even with everything else on her mind, she had to admit she was impressed. The main house was big and freshly painted white, with a wide porch that went all the way around the front. Behind it stood several large barns and other buildings, all of them looking sturdy and well kept. Horses were grazing in a field to the east, and she could see cattle scattered across the hills in the distance. This wasn't some little homestead. This was a cattle empire. She found Trent in one of the barns, brushing down a pretty chestnut mare. He glanced up when she walked in, and some unreadable expression crossed his face for just a second. "You came," he said. "Did you think I would not?" Zelda asked, lifting her chin a little. "I always pay my debts, Mr. Carson." "Trent," he said, correcting her. "If you are going to be working for me, we might as well skip the formalities." He put the brush down and stepped out of the horse stall, latching it behind him. Inside the barn, he seemed even bigger than he had at the saloon. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Can you cook?" "Good enough to keep folks from starving." "Know how to handle cattle?" Zelda paused for a moment. "I can learn." Trent looked her over for a long second, then gave a slow nod. Fair enough. Come on with me. He led her on a tour of the property, showing her the different buildings and telling her how the ranch was run. He had 15 men working for him, he explained, plus an older woman named Maria, who took care of the cooking and cleaning in the main house. Zelda's job would be to help Maria and also to work with the horses, which needed daily attention and training. I do not run a charity here, Trent said as they walked. Everyone pulls their own weight. You will work 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset. Sundays are yours to do as you please. You will take your meals with the ranch hands and sleep in the little cabin out behind the main house. It is not fancy, but it is clean, and it will keep the rain off. And how long will it take to pay off my debt? Zelda asked. Trent stopped and turned to look right at her. Based on the pot last night, you owe me about $2,000. At a fair wage for the kind of work you will be doing, I figure it will take about 5 years. 5 years. The words felt like a punch to the gut. 5 years of her life, all gone because of one bad hand of poker. Unless, Trent went on, his voice real deliberate, you had some other way of clearing this debt. Zelda's eyes got narrow. I am not that type of woman, Mr. Carson. Trent, he corrected her again, and that is not at all what I was getting at. He pushed a hand through his hair, looking like he would rather be anywhere else for the first time since they had met. Look, to be perfectly honest, I do not need another ranch hand. I'm already full up on help, but I surely do need someone who is smart with figures. Somebody who can manage the ledgers, handle the accounts, and talk business with the cattle buyers when they show up. My daddy took care of all that before he passed last year, and I have been bungling at something fierce ever since. You want me to keep your books? Zelda asked, her voice full of surprise. I was watching you last night, Trent said. The way you figured the odds, kept every card straight in your head, and played your hand even when you were down to your last chip. That takes a quick mind, so yes, if you can do that, if you can help me wrangle this ranch's money from a complete disaster into something that makes sense, then I reckon we could call it square in a year, maybe even sooner. The offer was a good one, a whole lot better than she had any reason to hope for. Zelda studied his face, looking for any sign he was lying, any hint of a hidden reason, but all she saw was honesty. Why, she had to ask. Why are you offering me this kindness? A muscle in Trent's jaw jumped. That was the tell she had noticed last night. Because I saw something in you yesterday, before the cards were even dealt. You walked into that saloon like you owned the whole town, even with the patches on your dress and your boots worn clean through. You took a seat at a table of men who wanted you gone, and you played with more sand than all of them put together. He stopped for a second, looking off into the distance. Reminded me of someone. Who? My sister, Trent said, his voice low. She passed on 3 years back. Calera. She had that same grit in her, that same way of refusing to let anybody tell her what she could or could not be. He cleared his throat, plainly unsettled by the feeling in his own voice. So, that is the reason why. Do you want the bookkeeper job or not? Yes, Zelda said, not missing a beat. Yes, I surely do. Good. Maria will get you to your cabin and help you get settled in. We can start tackling those books first thing in the morning. He started to walk away, but then he paused. And Zelda, welcome home to the Carson Ranch. The cabin was small, but it was clean and cozy, with a proper bed, a table and chair, and a little stove for cooking. Somebody had left a fresh stack of linens on the mattress and a pitcher of cool water on the table. Zelda dropped her satchel and sat down hard on the bed, just trying to make sense of the last 12 hours. She had gambled away everything she owned. She was in debt up to her eyeballs to a man she just met. And yet somehow, against all odds, she had been handed a shot at a better life than she had known in years. The next morning, Trent was right there on the porch of the main house with a pile of ledgers that looked like they had survived a cattle stampede. Papers were jammed between the pages. Notes were scrawled all over the edges, and the arithmetic was so knotted up that Zelda felt a headache coming on just from the sight of it. This is the whole sorry mess? She asked. That is the mess, Trent confirmed. looking a little ashamed. I can handle cattle and horses just fine, but numbers have never been my strong suit. Zelda pushed up her sleeves. Well, let us see what we are dealing with here. They went at it all morning long. Trent would explain all the different sales and dealings while Zelda waded through the mess, starting to sort it into something a person could understand. It did not take her long to figure out that the ranch was making more money than Trent even knew. He was selling his cattle for too little and paying too much for his supplies simply because he did not know how to haggle or watch the market prices. You have been getting taken to the cleaners, she told him, straight out around noon, tapping her finger on a stack of bills from a supplier down in San Antonio. These prices are a good 30% more than they ought to be. Trent leaned in over her shoulder, getting so close she could smell the leather and sage on him, and something that was just him. Her heart gave a little jump it had no business making. How can you tell that? He asked. My father was a merchant before he passed, Zelda explained, trying to keep her mind on the figures and not on how close he was standing. I spent my whole childhood around order forms and price talks. This fella is taking advantage of the fact that you do not know any better. Can you handle it? I can do more than handle it. I can find you honest suppliers and write up contracts that will save you thousands of dollars. She turned her head to look right at him and found his face was just inches away. Their eyes locked, and for a long second, the world just seemed to stop. Then Trent cleared his throat and took a step back. Now that would be a fine thing, a mighty fine thing indeed. The days started to run one into the next, settling into a rhythm that Zelda, to her surprise, found real comforting. Mornings were for wrangling the ranch's ledgers, taming that wild mess of paperwork into clean, proper records. Afternoons were for learning the other ways of ranch life. Maria taught her how to cook a decent meal for the whole crew. An old ranch hand named Pete showed her the right way to throw a rope and brand a calf. And Trent himself taught her to ride a horse better than she ever thought she could, starting her on some gentle mares before moving her up to horses with a bit more fire. He told her one afternoon, "You were born with a natural seat." She was guiding a feisty bay gelding in some smooth turns inside the corral. He said, "Most folks get all stiff when a horse acts up, but you stay loose. The horse feels that. My daddy always said, 'Fear is a thing that can spread,'" Zelda answered, bringing that gelding to a perfect halt. "But so is being sure of yourself. Your father was a smart man." Zelda swung down from the saddle and gave the gelding a good pat on the neck. "He passed on when I was 19, got killed during a robbery at his general store." "I'm truly sorry to hear that," Trent said, and the honest truth in his voice made her throat feel tight. "It happened a long time ago." She passed the reins to him. "What about your folks? You said your father passed, but what about your mother?" A shadow crossed Trent's face. "She was gone when I was 15. The same cholera that came back for my sister all those years later. After my father died last year, it was just me left, trying to hold this whole place together." "You have done a good job," Zelda said with a soft voice. "Your father would be mighty proud." A little warmth sparked in Trent's eyes. "Thank you. That means more to me than you'll ever know." As the weeks rolled on into months, Zelda found she was fitting into ranch life in ways she'd never dreamed. The work was hard, sure, but it was good, honest work. And for the first time since her father died, she felt like she truly belonged someplace. The ranch hands took to her once they saw she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. Maria became a second mother to her, sharing old family recipes and telling stories about Trent as a boy that made his ears turn red when Zelda teased him about them. And Trent, well, he had become someone she could not quite put a name to. They were together every day, and the cautious way they started out had softened into an easy friendship. He could make her laugh with his dry comments about the buyers who tried to pull a fast one on him. She made him chuckle reading the silliest notes from his old, messy ledgers. They bickered about the right way to gentle a colt and whether biscuits tasted better with butter or with honey. But their arguments never had any bite to them. They just felt alive. Then there were the other moments, the quiet ones that would set her heart to thumping. and make her forget to breathe. The way his hand would just barely touch hers when he handed her a cup of coffee. The look he would get when he watched her, thinking she did not notice. His face all soft and full of wonder. The way her stomach did a little flip every time he really smiled at her. Not the polite smile he had for strangers, but the true one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle up. She was falling for him. The thought hit Zelda one evening as she watched the big Texas sun dip below the horizon from her porch. She was falling hard and fast, and her sensible mind was screaming that it was a whole mess of trouble. She worked for him, she owed him money, and any feelings between them were just too complicated. But it seemed her heart just did not give a darn about complications. It was a Saturday night in late September, about 4 months after she first set foot on the ranch, when it all came to a head. Trent had gone into town that afternoon to talk with a man about buying some cattle, and he came back just as the sky was turning purple with a storm cloud on his face. "What is the matter?" Zelda asked, walking up to him at the stable as he was taking the saddle off his horse. "The buyer? He backed out," Trent said, his voice sharp with aggravation. "Said he got a better price on some cattle over in New Mexico. I was counting on that sale, Zelda. Without it, we are going to be in a tight spot to make payroll next month." Zelda's mind was already turning. She had been over the ranch's money for months now, and she knew where every single dollar came from and where it went. "What if we sell off some of the horses? The 3-year-olds are broke enough to bring a fair price. And you have that fella in Dallas who has been itching to buy from you for months." "Those horses are not quite ready," Trent said, shaking his head. "They could use another month of work at least." "Then we will work them harder," Zelda stated, her voice firm. "I will help you. We can have them ready in 3 weeks if we do it together." Trent just looked at her for a long spell, and you could see something change in his eyes. "You do not have to go and do this. The books are your job, not breaking horses." "I am a part of this ranch now," Zelda told him. "Your troubles are my troubles now." "Zelda." The way he spoke her name sent a shiver right down her spine. He took a step closer, and that big stable suddenly felt awfully small. "Do you have any idea what I think about when I am supposed to be concentrating on my work?" Her mouth felt as dry as a desert. "What?" "You," he said, "plain and simple. I think about the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, and the way you bite your lip when you are focused on those ledgers. I think about how you look first thing in the morning with your hair all down before you pin it back up." He reached out real slow, giving her plenty of time to back away, and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "I think about what it would be like to kiss you, Trent," Zelda whispered. But she could not tell if she was trying to stop him or begging him to continue. "Just tell me to stop," he said, his voice gone all rough. "Tell me this is a fool idea and that I am the man you work for and you owe me a debt, and this is just all kinds of wrong." "It is a terrible idea," Zelda agreed with him. "Completely improper. So I ought to stop." "I did not say that." He kissed her then. It was soft and careful at first, like he was waiting for her to push him away. But Zelda had no plans of pushing him anywhere. She had been waiting on this, wanting this, for more time than she was willing to admit. She kissed him right back with all the yearning she had kept bottled up for the last 4 months. Her hands balled up in the fabric of his shirt and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her in tight. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Trent rested his forehead against hers. "Well, that was even better than I imagined," he said. "You imagined it?" Zelda asked. And she could not keep the smile out of her voice. "About 1,000 times." He pulled back to look her in the eye, his face gone serious. "I know this whole situation between us is complicated. I know you are here on account of a debt, and that makes things between us unequal. But Zelda, I care for you. Not like an employee, not like someone who works on my ranch, but as a woman I am falling in love with. And if you do not feel that way, if you want me to back off and just keep things business, I will. I swear I will. But I had to tell you the truth. I had to let you know how I felt. Love." He had said the word love. Zelda's heart felt like it was about to beat right out of her chest. "You are right that the situation is complicated," she said slowly. But I would be telling a lie if I said I did not feel the exact same way. I have been fighting it, trying to tell myself it was just being grateful, or us being around each other so much, or anything but what it really is. But Trent, I think I am falling in love with you too. The smile that bloomed on his face was like the sun breaking through after a storm. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Zelda just melted right into him, into the solid feel of his body and the gentleness of his touch. "Your debt," he said when they finally came up for a breath of air. "Consider it paid. As of this moment, you do not owe me a single thing." "What?" "No." Zelda shook her head firm as could be. "I will not have you just forgiving my debt because we have gotten ourselves involved. That is not the right way. Zelda, you have saved me 10 times what you owed me in these last 4 months alone. The contracts you worked out, the waste you got rid of, the order you brought to all the finances. This ranch is making more money now than it has in 5 years. You have more than earned your way clear. Then pay me a fair wage," Zelda insisted. "Pay me what a good bookkeeper is worth, and let me pay off the debt the proper way. I want us to be equal in this, Trent. I want to know that whatever happens between us is because we both want it to, not because of some kind of duty or a debt hanging over my head." He looked at her face for a long time, and she could see the respect for her growing in his eyes. "All right," he agreed. "All right, we will do it your way. A fair wage and a proper accounting of the debt. But Zelda, I need you to know that you are free to walk away any time you want. If you ever want to leave, I will not stand in your way." "What if I do not want to go?" she asked in a soft voice. "What if I want to stay? Not on account of the debt, but because I am happy right here. Then I would say I am the luckiest man in all of Texas." They worked those horses together over the next 3 weeks, working from before sunrise until long after the sun went down. It was bone-tiring, dirty, and sometimes dangerous work, but Zelda cherished every single minute of it. She loved watching Trent with the animals, his patience and his skill showing in every single thing he did. She loved the way he taught her, never talking down to her or getting short, always building her up. And she loved the way they worked as one, knowing what the other needed, moving like a seamless team. The horses sold for even more than they had dared to hope, enough to not only make payroll, but to also put money into new breeding stock that would make the ranches herd better for years down the road. The buyer who came up from Dallas was so taken with the quality of the horses that he put in an order for 6 more to be delivered the very next spring. "We did it," Trent said as they watched the buyer's crew load the last horse into the transport wagon. He scooped Zelda up by the waist and spun her around in a big circle, and they were both laughing. "You brilliant, wonderful woman. We actually went and did it." When he set her back on her feet, they were both grinning like possums, and Zelda did not care one bit who saw when she pulled his head down for a kiss. Their feelings for each other grew deeper as the autumn leaves turned and winter started to settle in. They were careful to act professional around the ranch hands, but everybody on the place knew something had changed between them. Maria for sure knew. She started making little comments about how fine it would be to have a wedding on the ranch, and how the main house was way too big for just one person. "She is not very subtle, is she?" Zelda said one evening as she and Trent sat on the big porch of the main house, watching the first stars pop out in the sky. "About as subtle as a cattle stampede," Trent agreed. His arm was wrapped around her shoulders, and she was snuggled up against his side, a thick blanket pulled around the both of them to keep out the December chill. "Does it bother you, all her comments? I mean—" "No," Zelda said honestly. "Should it? I do not know. Some women might think it is moving too fast, too forward." Zelda tilted her head to look right up at him. "What about you? What do you think?" Trent was quiet for a second, his hand just rubbing her arm without thinking. "I think I knew that night we played poker, that you were going to turn my whole life around. I think I have been searching for you my entire life without even knowing who I was looking for. And I think that when you know something is right, how fast it happens does not matter one bit." "So, what are you trying to say?" Zelda asked, feeling her heart start to beat a little faster. I am saying that I love you, Trent said, turning so he could face her straight on. I am saying I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every single night. I am saying I want to build a life with you and raise a family with you and grow old with you. He took her hand and held it in his. I am saying I do not have a ring yet, and this here is probably the least fancy proposal in the whole history of proposals, but Zelda Calloway, will you marry me? Tears were just streaming down Zelda's face, but she was smiling so big that her cheeks started to hurt. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely. Yes. He kissed her then, a kiss that was deep and sweet and full of every promise for the future. And Zelda knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was exactly where she was always meant to be. They were married on a clear, crisp January morning in 1879, in the little church down in San Antonio, with Maria and Pete and every single one of the ranch hands there to see it. Zelda wore a simple cream-colored dress that Maria had helped her craft, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Trent was in his finest suit, his hair actually behaving for once, and he looked so danged handsome that Zelda's heart nearly stopped when she saw him at the altar. The ceremony itself was short and sweet, but full of heart. When the preacher declared them man and wife, and Trent kissed her right there in front of God and everybody, Zelda felt like the luckiest soul on earth. The party that followed back at the ranch had enough food, music, and dancing to go on clear past midnight. At one point, Trent gently pulled Zelda from the celebration, guiding her out toward the stable. "Just where are you taking me?" she asked, a laugh in her voice as he led her along. "I've got something for you," he said. "A wedding gift." He swung open the stable door and walked her to a stall way at the back. Inside stood the most magnificent horse Zelda had ever laid eyes on. It was a black stallion with a single white star on his forehead, powerful and proud and somehow very familiar. "Trent," she whispered, "is that Thunder?" He nodded. "You won him fair and square that night in the saloon, even though I ended up with the winning hand. You put everything on the line in that game, and I've always felt like I took something you rightfully earned. So he is yours now, all yours." Zelda just stared at the horse, and then back at her new husband, completely stunned by how much this meant. Thunder was worth a small fortune, but he was more than that. He was a symbol of everything Trent held dear, and he was giving the horse to her. "I can't take this," she said, her voice soft. "He means too much to you." "You mean more," Trent answered simply. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Besides, I got to thinking about what you said that night, about winning more than just the horse. And you did, Zelda. You won a whole lot more." "What did I win?" she asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. "Me," he said. "You won my respect, my admiration, and after a while my whole heart. You won a home and a family and a future. You won every last thing I have to give." He turned her in his arms so they were face to face. "Just like I won everything the moment you agreed to marry me." She kissed him right then, there in the quiet of the stable with Thunder looking on. And it felt like a sacred promise. It was a promise of all the days yet to come, all the adventures they'd have, and all the love they would build between them. Their first year as a married couple was a mix of wonderful and difficult. Zelda poured herself into managing the business side of the ranch with even more fire. And with her watching the books, the Carson Ranch became one of the most successful outfits in the whole territory. She made deals that made other ranchers jealous and caught several crooked suppliers trying to cheat them. Trent started calling her his secret weapon, and she knew he wasn't really kidding. But they also learned the tougher side of being partners. They had their first real fight that March, over putting money into some high-dollar breeding stock or saving it as a safety net for a bad year. Zelda wanted to play it safe. Trent wanted to take the gamble. They went back and forth for 2 whole days, both of them stubborn as mules and sure they were right. In the end, they found a middle ground, buying half the animals Trent wanted, and keeping half the savings Zelda knew they needed. It was a powerful lesson in being married, Zelda thought later on. Neither one of them got their way completely, but they had both listened and showed respect. That breeding stock proved to be a smart move. By the next spring, they had a handful of foals that showed amazing promise, and cattle buyers were already making offers on them without even seeing them, just based on their bloodlines. "You were right," Zelda admitted one evening as they watched the young horses play out in the pasture. "We were both right," Trent corrected, pulling her in tight. "That's the whole point of being a team." Then in July of 1880, Zelda found out she was pregnant. She told Trent over dinner one night. It was just the two of them at that big dining table in the main house, which did not seem too big anymore now that they filled it with their love and laughter. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes going wide. "As sure as a person can be without a doctor saying so," Zelda replied, watching his face for any sign. They had talked about having children, but talking about it and it actually happening were two different things. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy?" Trent shot up so fast his chair clattered over behind him. He rushed around the table and pulled her up into his arms. "Zelda, I'm happier than a pig in mud. I'm way beyond happy. I'm going to be a father." He pulled back to get a good look at her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You're going to be a mother. We're going to be parents." "We are," Zelda agreed. And all at once it felt incredibly real and a little bit scary and absolutely perfect. The pregnancy was not an easy ride. Zelda was sick as a dog for the first 3 months and could barely hold down a sip of water. Trent worried over her day and night, always bringing her crackers and ginger tea and rubbing her back when the sickness got real bad. Maria moved into one of the guest rooms just so she could be there to help look after Zelda. That tough old ranch woman turned as soft and motherly as could be, cooking special meals and fussing over Zelda like she was made of fine china. "I'm not an invalid, you know," Zelda protested one afternoon when both Trent and Maria told her she had to rest instead of working on the account books. "No, but you're carrying precious cargo," Maria said in a tone that meant the subject was closed. "The books will still be there tomorrow. You need to look after yourself and that little one." As the months went by and Zelda's belly started to grow, she had to admit they might be right. She got tired more easily, and her ankles would swell up if she was on her feet too long. But she also felt this deep sense of calm and purpose. She was making a life, a whole new person, who would be a part of her and Trent. And the pure wonder of it all never went away. Trent was impossibly gentle with her during those months. He would talk to her belly every night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making promises about the life they would have. He built a cradle with his own 2 hands, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as silk. And he never complained, not even once, when she woke him in the dead of night because she had a craving for pickles, or couldn't get comfortable, or just needed him to hold her close. "I love you," she told him one night in February of 1881, as they lay there in bed with his hand resting on her very round belly. "I love you so much it's frightening sometimes." "I know that feeling," Trent said softly. "Sometimes I just look at you, and I can't hardly believe this is my life, that you're my wife, that we're about to have a baby. It feels too good to be real." "It is real," Zelda promised him. "Zelda, this is our life, and we earned it." Their son was born on a warm evening in March, coming into the world in a hurry after many hard hours of labor. Trent stayed with Zelda through the entire thing, ignoring the midwife who insisted that men belong somewhere else. He held her hand and whispered words of encouragement, and let her squeeze his fingers hard enough to leave bruises. When the baby finally made his appearance, screaming and red-faced and absolutely perfect, the midwife cleaned him up and laid him in Zelda's arms. She looked down at her son, at his tiny little fingers, and that mess of dark hair so much like Trent's, and she felt her heart grow bigger than she ever thought possible. "Well, hello there," she whispered. "Hello, little fella, we've been waiting for you." She noticed then that Trent was crying, with tears just streaming down his face as he looked at their son. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Zelda, he's just absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Trent's father and gave him the middle name of James after Zelda's father, Thomas James Carson. and he was without a doubt the most loved baby in the great state of Texas. Those first few months of being parents were downright exhausting. Thomas was a fussy little thing who did not care much for sleeping and seemed to want to be held every minute of the day and night. Zelda and Trent took turns with him at night, pacing the long hallway while singing lullabies and making soft shushing sounds. They were both tired down to the bone, getting by on a few snatched hours of sleep whenever they could. But even in all that exhaustion, there was so much joy. The first time Thomas really smiled at Zelda, she just burst into tears. The first time he reached out for Trent, wrapping his tiny fist around his daddy's finger, Trent looked over at Zelda with such pure wonder that she fell in love with him all over again. They figured out this whole parenthood thing together, learning as they went. Zelda kept managing the ranch's finances, but now she did it from home, with Thomas sleeping in a basket right next to her desk. Trent started cutting back on his longer trips, not wanting to be gone from his family for too long. They got real good at working as a team while one of them held the baby, passing Thomas back and forth whenever they needed to. "We make a good team," Trent said one afternoon, after they had managed to go over a contract, feed Thomas, and settle a squabble between two ranch hands, all in about an hour. "The best team," Zelda agreed, bouncing Thomas on her hip. "Though I'll be honest, I'm sure looking forward to the day he sleeps all the way through the night." That day did come, though it took a little longer than either of them would have liked. But by the time Thomas turned 1 year old, he had finally settled into a routine that worked for the whole family. He was a bright, curious boy, always getting into something, and Zelda could already see her own stubbornness and Trent's quiet determination in his little personality. "We are in for a world of trouble when he gets older," she said one evening, watching as Thomas tried over and over to pull himself up on the furniture no matter how many times he tumbled down, repeatedly. "We are in a heap of trouble," Trent agreed, but a wide grin was spread across his face. "But we will get through it. We can handle anything, long as we are side by side." The ranch kept on growing something fierce over the next few years. Word got around about the top-notch quality of the Carson horses and cattle, and pretty soon they had folks coming all the way from California to buy from them. Zelda's knack for numbers meant they made it through the lean times without any real trouble, and Trent's way with animals meant their livestock was always wanted. They bought up more land, making their operation bigger. They put up a new barn and brought on more ranch hands. They became good, solid folks in the San Antonio community, known for always giving a square deal and a helping hand. When a drought hit, and a lot of the smaller ranchers were struggling, Trent and Zelda offered them work and support without a second thought. When the church needed a new roof, they gave the money. When a widow needed help, they were the first ones there. "Your daddy would be mighty proud of the man you turned out to be," Zelda told Trent one evening. They were watching the sun go down from their porch, with little Thomas playing right at their feet. "Both our daddies would be proud," Trent corrected her gently. "Just look at what we have built together, Zelda. I am not just talking about the ranch, but this whole life, our family. I could not have done a lick of this without you." "We did it together," Zelda said, her own words from years ago coming back to her. "That is what being married is all about, a partnership." In the spring of 1884, Zelda found out she was expecting again. This time, the pregnancy went a whole lot smoother, maybe because she knew what was coming. She did not feel nearly as sick, and while she still got worn out, she felt more sure of herself and her ability to handle it all. Their daughter was born in November, coming into the world quick and without all the fuss of Thomas's birth. She had Zelda's auburn hair and green eyes, and from the second she arrived, she had her father wrapped clean around her tiny little finger. They named her Rose after Trent's sister, and she was as different from Thomas as night and day. Where he was always worked up, she was as calm as a summer morning. Where he fought sleep with everything he had, she just dozed off peaceful and content. She was an easy baby, and Zelda was mighty grateful for it. Thomas, who was now 3 years old, needed someone watching him every second to keep him from climbing on everything or trying to ride horses that were way too big for him. "That boy has no fear in him," Trent said one afternoon, lifting Thomas down from a fence he had scaled. "He gets that honest from you," Zelda pointed out. "I seem to recall someone telling me a story about how you tried to break a wild Mustang when you were just 7. Now that is different. I was practically a grown man. You were 7. Like I said, practically grown." Zelda just laughed and bounced little Rose in her arms, watching her husband roughhouse with their son. This was her life now. It was a million miles away from that desperate night in the saloon when she had bet it all on a single hand of cards. She thought she was just playing for money to survive. But what she was really gambling for was this. For everything she had ever wanted without even knowing, she wanted it. That evening, long after the children were tucked in bed, Trent found Zelda in the office, looking over the quarterly reports. He leaned against the doorframe, just watching her work with that soft look he got on his face sometimes when he thought she was not looking. "What is it?" she asked, glancing up from the big ledger book. "I was just thinking about the night we met," Trent said, walking across the room to sit on the corner of her desk. "About how you came strolling into that saloon and turned my whole world upside down." "I walked in there and lost everything I had," Zelda corrected him. "Did you really?" Trent reached over and took her hand in his. "Because from where I am sitting, it sure looks like you won it all. A home, a family, a true partner, love." Zelda put her pen down and stood up, moving to stand right there between his knees. "Do you remember what you told me that night, right after I showed my cards?" "I said a whole lot of things that night." "You said I won more than just the horse." Zelda wrapped her arms around his neck. "You were right. I won so much more than that. I won you. I won this life. I won every dream I never dared to dream, because I was sure they were impossible." "Not impossible," Trent said, pulling her in close. "They were just waiting for the right time, the right hand of cards." "The right gamble," Zelda agreed. He kissed her right then, a slow and sweet kiss that even after all their years of marriage still made her heart beat a little faster. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he said in a quiet voice. "For what?" "For taking a chance that night. For coming out to the ranch. For staying. For building this life right alongside me. For giving me Thomas and Rose and everything else. For being exactly the woman you are." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "I know this all started as a debt, but Zelda, you have given me more than I could ever hope to repay." "Well, then I suppose that makes us even," Zelda said, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Because you gave me the very same things." The years just kept rolling by in a happy blur of hard work and love. Thomas grew into a confident young man who could ride almost as good as his father by the time he was 7. He had Trent's natural way with horses and Zelda's quick mind for figures. Rose was the quieter one, but she was just as determined. And she took to drawing early on, spending hours sketching the ranch animals in the wide-open landscape. In 1887, Zelda gave birth to twin boys, who they named Matthew and Mark. The pregnancy had been a tough one, and the birth was touch and go there for a little while. It was scary enough that Trent had worn a path in the hallway outside their room, until the doctor finally came out and told him that Zelda and both his baby boys were healthy. 4 children, Trent said that night, looking at the 2 tiny babies sleeping in their bassinets while Zelda rested in bed. "We have 4 children, Zelda." "No, I was there," she said, sounding tired but with a smile in her voice. "Are you feeling overwhelmed?" "Terrified," he admitted with a small laugh, "but also happier than I have ever been in my entire life." The twins were a real handful, just like twins usually are. They were full of mischief and always looking for an adventure, getting into anything and everything. They learned to walk early and right away used that new skill to get away from anyone trying to keep them corralled. By the time they were 2, Zelda was sure they had aged her 10 years. But they also brought so much joy to the family. Thomas and Rose just doted on their little brothers, and all the ranch hands pitched in to help watch the boys when their taste for adventure got to be a bit much. It takes a village, Zelda thought to herself. But thank the good Lord they had built a fine one. The ranch kept on growing and doing well. They bought a neighboring property when the owner decided to retire, adding another 1,000 acres to their land. They started breeding quarter horses in addition to their cattle business, and those horses got to be famous all over the Southwest for being so fast and smart. Zelda had paid off her poker debt a long time ago, but she kept on managing the ranch's money and all the business deals. She had a sharp eye for a good opportunity and an even sharper one for anybody trying to pull a fast one on them. Trent called her his fiercest protector, and he was not wrong about that. In 1891, when Thomas was 10 and starting to take a real interest in how the ranch was run, Trent started teaching him how to manage the cattle and work with the hands. At the same time, Zelda started teaching him how to keep the books and the principles of good business. They wanted their children to understand every part of the ranch, so they could make smart decisions for themselves when they got older. "You reckon he will want to stay?" Trent asked her one night as they watched Thomas working with one of the young horses. "Or will he want to go off and see the world, find his own way?" "I reckon we ought to raise him to have choices," Zelda replied. "We'll give him all the tools he needs to make a good life, no matter what he chooses. Then, we just have to trust he'll choose right." "When did you get so dang smart?" "Well, I had the good sense to marry you, didn't I? That shows some mighty fine judgment." Trent chuckled and pulled her in close, planting a kiss on her hair. They stood there in the fading sunlight, watching their boy work, and a deep peace settled over Zelda. This right here was what she'd been betting on all those years ago, even if she hadn't known it at the time. This quiet, this love, this feeling of knowing where you belong. The card game that kicked it all off felt like it happened in another lifetime, to a whole different woman. That scared young girl who walked into a saloon with nothing but the clothes on her back was a stranger to her now. Zelda had built a new person from the ground up, someone stronger and surer of herself. But she never once forgot where she came from or the hard lessons she'd learned along the way. She taught her children how to play cards, how to figure the odds, and how to read a person's intentions. But she also taught them that the biggest wagers in life had nothing to do with money or property. The real gambles were about trust and love, and having faith in yourself and the folks around you. "Your mama won me in a game of poker," Trent told Thomas one afternoon when the boy asked how they met. "For real?" Thomas's eyes got as big as saucers. "She won you." "Well, to be honest, I was the one who won the hand," Trent confessed. "But looking back on it all, I think she's the one who walked away with everything that truly mattered." Thomas mulled that over for a minute. "Does that mean I can play cards for a wife when I'm grown?" "Not a chance," Zelda said firmly, walking up right behind them. "You will court a nice young lady the proper way and win her heart, not her hand." "But you didn't do that," Thomas pointed out with the simple logic of a 10-year-old. "You do as I say, not as I did," Zelda told him. But a smile played on her lips. "Besides, our story is one of a kind. Most folks don't find their true love sitting across a poker table." "Did you know Dad was your true love when you won him?" Thomas asked. Zelda looked over at Trent, who was watching her with that gentle look in his eyes she loved so much. "No," she said, telling the honest truth. "I didn't know much of anything back then, except that I was in a world of trouble and just trying to see the next sunrise. But sometimes the very things we need the most find us when we aren't even looking." "That's confusing," Thomas said. "Love usually is," Trent told his son, "but it is always worth the trouble." In 1895, when Rose was 11, she declared she wanted to attend school in San Antonio to study painting. It was a heart-wrenching choice for Zelda and Trent. They had taught their children at home, with Zelda handling books and numbers while Trent took care of history and science. The ranch had always been their entire world. But Rose had a gift, a true God-given talent, and she deserved a chance to see it bloom. "We have to let her go," Zelda said, though her heart felt like it was breaking in two at just the thought of it. "We have to give her wings and trust that she'll remember the way home." So Rose went, staying with a good family in the city during the school months, and coming back to the ranch on weekends and for the whole summer. She blossomed in that new place, and her artwork got better than they could have imagined with real teachers. And she sure did come back every chance she got, because this ranch was still her home, and her family, was still her whole heart. The twin boys grew into strong young men, both of them standing taller than their father by the time they turned 16. Matthew decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, captivated by the science of healing animals. Mark wanted to be a rancher, just like his dad, and he already had a natural feel for working the land and the cattle. "We did all right," Trent said one evening in 1899 as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had become their habit over the years, this quiet spell they shared at the close of each day. Thomas was 20 years old now, working full-time on the ranch and seeing a sweet girl from town. Rose was 15 and thriving with her art. The twins were 12 and still finding their share of trouble, but they were good boys deep down. "We sure did," Zelda agreed, leaning her head on her husband's shoulder. They were both in their 40s now, not young anymore, but a long way from old. Trent had some gray showing at his temples and lines around his eyes, from years of smiling. Zelda had threads of silver woven into her auburn hair and hands that were toughened by years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they could still see the two people they were that night in the saloon when their whole world turned upside down. "You ever have second thoughts?" Trent asked in a low voice. "About the card game, I mean. The way we got our start." "Never," Zelda said without a moment's hesitation. "Not for one single second. Do you?" "My only regret is that I didn't kiss you sooner," Trent said. "I wasted 4 whole months trying to be noble when I could have been kissing you." "You're making up for lost time now," Zelda assured him. And she was telling the truth. Even after nearly 20 years of marriage, Trent still gave her a kiss every morning before he left and every evening when he walked back in the door. He still reached out for her hand whenever they walked somewhere. He still looked at her like she was the most precious thing this side of heaven. In the spring of 1901, Thomas married his sweetheart, a wonderful young woman named Catherine, who fit right into the family like she'd always been there. They threw a huge wedding right on the ranch, and it seemed like half of San Antonio came to celebrate. As she watched her son promise his life to another, Zelda cried happy tears and squeezed Trent's hand tight. "That was us, once upon a time," she whispered. "That's still us," Trent whispered back. "Every single day." Thomas and Catherine settled into one of the houses on the property, a cottage Trent had built for them as a wedding gift. Before a year had passed, they gave Zelda and Trent their first grandchild, a baby girl they named Zelda in honor of her grandmother. Holding that little namesake for the very first time, Zelda was flooded with a wave of feeling. This tiny little person was the result of a choice she had made so long ago. If she had never walked into that saloon, if she had never sat down at that poker table, if she had never taken that wild chance, this child would not be here. None of this would be here. "What's on your mind?" Trent asked, watching her rock their granddaughter. "I'm thinking about how things are meant to be," Zelda said. "About how a single decision can change the course of everything. How one night can start a chain of events that leads you to this moment." She looked up at him. "I'm thinking about how thankful I am that I was brave enough to take that risk." "I am thankful you were brave enough too," Trent said. "Every single day I wake up feeling grateful." The years kept rolling on, bringing with them change and growth. Rose came back from her schooling a brilliant artist and opened a gallery in San Antonio, though she always kept her room at the ranch. Matthew headed off to veterinary school, back east, becoming the first Carson to ever go to a university. Mark stayed right there on the ranch, working shoulder to shoulder with his father and brother to manage the ever-growing spread. The twins ended up falling in love with a pair of sisters, which tickled everyone, and they got married in a double ceremony that the whole county talked about for months. More grandkids came along, filling the ranch house with the happy sounds of children's laughter all over again. Zelda and Trent eased into their 50s and then their 60s. Their hair turned gray and they moved a little slower, but the love between them was as strong as it had ever been. They had built a cattle empire together, but more than that, they had built a family, a legacy that would carry on long after they were gone. For their 30th wedding anniversary, Trent took Zelda back to the very saloon where they had first met. It had a new owner now and was a bit cleaner and more respectable than it had been back in 1878, but they could still see the old place underneath. "What in the world are we doing here?" Zelda asked, completely puzzled. Trent led her over to the same table where they had played cards all those years ago. He pulled out a chair for her, and once she was seated, he sat down across from her and took out a fresh deck of cards. "One more hand," he said, "for old time's sake." "And what are the stakes this time?" Zelda asked, a smile playing on her lips. "How about this?" Trent reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "The deed to the entire Carson Ranch. I'm betting it all on a single hand of poker." "Trent, you've gone plumb crazy. Half of that ranch is already mine. I know that, but I've always been a gambling man." He dealt the cards with a smooth, familiar skill. "Are you in?" Zelda looked down at her cards, and then she looked up at her husband. He was 62 years old now, with more salt than pepper in his hair, and deep lines carved into his face by years of sunshine and laughter. But his eyes were still the same color as warm amber whiskey, and the way he looked at her still made her feel like she was 22 again, about to make the biggest bet of her whole life. "I'm in," she said. They played out the hand nice and slow, savoring every moment. Zelda ended up winning with 3 of a kind, beating Trent's 2 pair. He tossed his cards on the table with a big dramatic sigh. "I'm ruined," he declared. "You have won everything I have." "I won everything that mattered 30 years ago," Zelda corrected him. She stood up and walked around the table to sit right there in his lap. To heck with what anyone thought. "I won it the night you looked at me from across this table and saw a worthy opponent instead of just some desperate girl. I won it every day after that when you treated me as your equal. I won it the day you gave me your heart." Trent wrapped his arms around her and held her tight. "Do you remember what I said that night? After the game was over, you said a whole lot of things. I said, you won more than that tonight." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "I wasn't talking about the horse, Zelda. I was talking about me. You won me that night, and I have been yours ever since." "I know," Zelda said, her voice soft. "I've always known." And they kissed right there in that old saloon. They had begun as 2 people who knew nothing of each other and ended up meaning everything, a journey that had now come full circle. The ranch prospered, guided by the hands of the next generation. Thomas had his father's touch for running the place, and with Catherine's sharp mind for business, they elevated the Carson Ranch to incredible new levels. They brought in modern methods, started new breeding programs, and found ways to sell their cattle in new markets. Zelda and Trent slowly stepped back, shifting from running the show to offering their wisdom. Their days were filled with the grandkids, who were everything from toddlers to teenagers. Zelda taught them how to play a mean game of poker, how to read a person's intentions, and how to think 2 steps ahead. Trent taught them how to ride, how to care for the land and the animals, and how to work hard and always be fair. On those warm summer evenings, the entire family would gather on the sprawling porch of the main house. 3 generations breaking bread and swapping tales. Zelda would look out at her children and her grandchildren, with the ranch rolling out before them, and feel a quiet, profound peace. "Grandma, tell us the story of how you and Grandpa met," one of the little ones would always ask, and Zelda would tell it all over again. She'd talk about walking into a saloon with not a penny to her name. She'd talk about a poker game that changed her destiny, and about a cowboy who looked at her and saw something he wanted to keep forever. "So Grandma really won Grandpa's horse," the children would chime in. "She won a whole lot more than that," Trent would say every time, pulling Zelda into his arms. "She won my heart." In the winter of 1912, when Zelda was 66 and Trent was 70, they finally took that trip to the coast they'd always talked about. They stayed for a week in a little hotel that looked out over the Gulf, just walking on the beach and watching the waves roll in. "Do you remember what you said to me when I asked you to be my wife?" Trent asked one evening, as they sat on the sand watching the sun go down. "You asked me if this was all real," Zelda said softly. You asked if our life was real, or if it was just too good to be true, and you told me it was real, because we had earned it. He took her hand, his weathered fingers lacing through hers. You were right about that. Every single happy day, every joyful moment, we earned it all. We earned it by choosing each other, by working side by side, and by never, ever giving up on what we had. We sure did earn it, Zelda agreed. And Trent, I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Every tough day, every single challenge, every last moment of doubt, I'd live it all again just to end up right here with you. Even that poker game? Losing everything you had and owing a stranger? Especially that poker game, Zelda said with certainty, because that was the night my life truly began. That was the night that I found you. They stayed by the coast a few more days before heading back home to the ranch and their family. Life went on in its familiar rhythm. The seasons turned, the grandkids grew, and the ranch changed with the times. Trent's health started to give out in 1915. It wasn't anything sudden, just the slow wearing down of a body that had put in 73 hard years of work. He got tired quicker and moved a little slower. But his mind was as sharp as ever, and his love for Zelda never faded one bit. On a peaceful evening in May of that year, Zelda was sitting by his bed holding his hand when Trent looked over at his wife and smiled. "You know what the best hand I ever played was?" he asked, his voice a quiet whisper, but clear. "What was it?" Zelda asked, though tears were already rolling down her cheeks because she knew why he was asking. She knew what was coming next. "It was the one I lost to you," Trent said. "The one that brought you walking into my life. That was the best hand I ever played, even though I lost every penny." "You didn't lose," Zelda insisted, her grip on his hand tightening. "We both won that night." "You're right," Trent agreed. "We won it all." He lifted his free hand and gently touched her cheek. "I love you, Zelda Carson. I've loved you from that very first night in that saloon, and I'll love you long after this life is over." "I love you too," Zelda whispered back. "Always." Trent closed his eyes right then, and with his family all around him and Zelda's hand in his, he slipped away without a struggle, a man who had lived a good, long life and loved with all his heart. The grief was a heavy, crushing weight. Zelda felt like she had lost a part of herself, the partner who had made her entire world possible. She mourned with everything she had, held up by her children and grandchildren who kept her from shattering completely. But even inside all that sorrow, there was thankfulness. She was grateful for 36 years of marriage, for 4 children and 11 grandchildren, and for a life they had built from scratch with love and hard work. She was grateful for every morning they had seen the sun rise together, every evening they had watched it set, and every single moment in between. Zelda lived on for another 7 years after Trent passed, staying busy with the ranch and spending her time with her growing family. She taught her great-grandchildren how to play poker, passing down the very skills that had turned her own life around. She told them stories about Trent, keeping his memory bright and clear for the little ones who hadn't gotten to know him for long. On warm evenings, she would sit out on the porch where she and Trent had passed so many hours, and she could almost feel him sitting there right beside her. In those moments, it was easy to think back to that long-ago night in a dusty saloon, when a desperate young woman had made the biggest bet of her life and won a world she never even knew she could wish for. In the spring of 1922, Zelda passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76. Her children laid her to rest next to Trent in the family cemetery, up on a hill that looked out over the ranch they had built together. It felt like the whole county came to pay their respects to a woman who had become a legend, not just for her sharp business mind or her skill with a deck of cards, but for the incredible way she had loved and been loved in return. The Carson Ranch continued to flourish as it was passed down through the generations. Each new family added something of their own, but they never lost sight of the core values that Zelda and Trent had started it all with. The story of how they met became a sacred family tale, told over and over to every new child. And in a special place of honor in the ranch house hanging on the wall was a single framed playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "In memory of the poker game that started it all, 1878." Because that's what it all boiled down to in the end. One single poker game, one huge gamble, one night when a woman who had nothing left put it all on the line and won more than she had ever dreamed. She had won a partner, a family, and a legacy that would last. She had won a love that reached beyond a lifetime. She had certainly won his best horse that night, that much was true. But more than that, she had won his respect, his trust, and his entire heart. And by winning those things, she had truly won everything that ever mattered. The story came to a close there in that little family plot on a Texas hill where two souls who had found each other against impossible odds could finally rest together for eternity. But the love they had built, the family they had raised, and the lessons they had taught lived on, passed from one generation to the next. It was all the proof anyone needed that sometimes the biggest risks you take lead you to the greatest rewards of all. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.